I've got a guy who comes into my shop maybe twice a year, holding a receiver he bought off a marketplace app for way too much money with a story about how the listing said fully tested sounds amazing. Every time I open the bottom cover, and within about 90 seconds, I can tell you exactly why it doesn't sound amazing anymore. Sometimes it's an afternoon fix. Sometimes it's a part that simply doesn't exist anymore. Gone since 1986, never tooled again. At that point, you're not looking at a stereo, you're looking at a very heavy doorstop. So today, 7 receivers I'll personally stand behind as long-term keepers. Not the rarest, not the loudest spec sheet, the ones I can still get parts for that were honestly built and that a competent tech anywhere in the country can keep alive another 50 years. Counting down from 7 to 1. The one at the top is the receiver I'd hand to my own grandkids without a second thought. If that's the kind of straight talk you're after, consider subscribing. I put one of these out most weeks. No hype, just what I see on the bench. 3 words before we start, and every pick has to pass all of them. Steel, solder, supply. Steel is the iron, transformer mass, heat sinks, chassis weight that exists for a reason, not for show. A receiver that runs hot because it's actually working hard ages a lot better than one that's just heavy. Solder is the workmanship. Some factories hand-stuffed these boards beautifully. Others rushed them off the line with marginal flux, and you'll find cracked joints the day the unit turns 40, sometimes from the very same brand 2 years apart in production. Supply is the one nobody talks about enough about, and it's the one that decides everything else. Can you still buy the output transistor, the slide pot, the selector switch wafer? If the answer's no, steel and solder don't matter. You're sitting on a beautiful paperweight. All right, let's get into it. Number 7, Sherwood S-7200 and the S-7100. Sherwood never got the marketing budget Pioneer or Marantz got, and that's exactly why this one's a sleeper. The S-7200 is a conservatively engineered mid-power receiver, somewhere in the 45 to 50 watt per channel range, and the circuit inside is refreshingly plain. No exotic switching schemes, no boutique output topology, just a clean, honest Class AB design built with parts that were common across half the Japanese industry at the time. Here's why a tech respects it. The power supply caps and the output devices in this thing belong to the same families used across dozens of other receivers from the era, which means when one fails, you're not hunting for a unicorn part. You're pulling something off a shelf that 100 other repairs already used. The tone control pots get scratchy with age, the selector switch wafers oxidize and need a proper cleaning rather than just a quick spray, and the dial lamps are the usual incandescent type that eventually go dark. None of that is exotic work. I'd call all of it routine maintenance, not repair. There's also a quiet build detail worth mentioning. Sherwood used a heavier gauge chassis on this model than you'd expect for the price point it sold at originally, which is part of why these survive in better physical shape than their reputation suggests. The transformer doesn't run hot under normal listening levels, and I have yet to see one with heat stress discoloration on the board around the power supply, which tells me the design wasn't being pushed past its comfort zone at the factory. Now the honest part. Sherwood doesn't have the collector following the bigger names do, which cuts both ways. The upside is you'll find clean examples for $250 to $500 all day long, often underpriced because the badge doesn't excite anybody. The downside is fewer specialty techs have personally restored a stack of these, so you may be doing more of your own homework, your own multimeter work, instead of handing it to somebody who's done 50 of them. For a patient owner willing to learn the unit, this is one of the best dollar-for-dollar keepers on the used market. Number 6. Realistic STA2880. Yes, the Radio Shack one. I know what some of you are thinking, and I get it. The private label badge throws people off, but this receiver was built for Radio Shack by an established Japanese factory with real engineering behind it. And on the bench, it punches well above its department store reputation. We're talking real power into real loads, a genuinely solid power supply, and a chassis that doesn't flex when you pick it up by one corner, which tells you something about how much steel actually went into it. The failure points are well understood at this point. The power switch and some of the front panel slide switches oxidize and need a real teardown and cleaning rather than just contact cleaner sprayed in blind. And the dial lamps are old incandescent bulbs that eventually go dark, though LED replacements are simple and widely available now. The output stage uses transistors that overlap with several other receivers from that same period, so when sourcing isn't a headache people assume just because of the badge on the front. I want to add one thing here that surprises people. The phono preamp stage on this unit is genuinely quiet by the standards of the era. I've put a few of these on the scope over the years out of pure curiosity, and the noise floor on the phono input held up better than I expected for a house brand receiver. That's not a guarantee every unit will measure the same. Components drift differently over 50 years, but it tells you the original design work wasn't an afterthought. The honest part is documentation. Because it wears a house brand, there isn't the deep specialty forum history that a Pioneer or a Marantz has, so finding a tech who specifically rebuilt 20 of them is harder. But the circuit itself isn't mysterious, and any competent solid-state tech can work through it with a service manual and a Saturday afternoon. Expect to pay $200 to $450 for a clean one, which, watt for watt, is one of the better deals left in this hobby. Number 5. Kenwood KR-6600. This is the receiver I point people toward when they tell me they want a real one, but don't want to spend flagship money. The KR-6600 sits in Kenwood's mid-power lineup, somewhere around 50 watts per channel, and it carries the same overbuilt philosophy Kenwood used on their bigger units, just without quite as much iron in the transformer. That's fine. It means it runs a little cooler and a little easier on itself over decades of use. What I like on the bench is how conventional the output stage is. These use common discrete output transistors that show up across a wide swath of Kenwood's catalog from the same years, so when a tech tells you, "I've got that transistor in stock," they usually mean it. The bias and idle current adjustment is a well-documented procedure, not some buried trim pot nobody talks about, and it's the kind of job that takes 15 minutes with a meter and a service manual once the unit is warmed up properly. The main weak spot is the same one you'll find in almost every receiver of this vintage: drying electrolytic capacitors around the power supply and around the tone circuitry, and that's a routine recap, not an emergency. I'd also flag the rear panel speaker selector switches as a point worth inspecting before you buy. They're rated to handle the current, but corrosion on the contacts over the decades can cause one channel to drop out intermittently, which an unfamiliar owner will sometimes misdiagnose as a dead output transistor, when it's really just a dirty switch. The fair part to mention, Kenwood's mid-power units don't carry the same showroom presence as their big silver flagships, so resale is modest. That's actually good news for a buyer. A properly serviced KR-6600 runs $300 to $600, and it will play music reliably longer than most people reading this will own a house. Number 4. Sansui 5000X. Now we get into genuine cult territory. The 5000X in its walnut cabinet is one of the best-looking receivers ever built, and underneath that gorgeous faceplate is a power section with real headroom, somewhere in the 55 to 65 watts per channel, depending on the exact revision. Sansui's output stage design from this period has earned a loyal following among techs because it's musical and it's repairable, not because it's mysterious or hard to understand. Here's the bench reality, though. The power transformer on the 5000X is large and heavy, which is good, but the mounting hardware and the wiring runs near it are original cloth-insulated wire on some units, and that insulation gets brittle with age and can crack if disturbed carelessly during a repair. The front panel slide switches, function selector, tape monitor, loudness are the most common failure point, and they need a proper tear down and clean rather than a quick spray, or they'll keep acting up within a few months of a half-hearted fix. The good news is the output devices and most of the small signal transistors are still sourced with not much trouble, and there's enough of a restoration community around this model that I'm rarely guessing. I'll also mention the VU meters because people ask. The lamps behind them dim with age, just like every receiver of this era, but the meter movements themselves on the 5000X have held their calibration impressively well in the units I've serviced. I don't see the needle drift you sometimes get on cheaper meter assemblies from other brands. It's a small detail, but it's the kind of small detail that tells you where Sansui spent their money. The honest caveat, because this is one of the more desirable wood-grain Sansuis, prices have climbed, and you'll see a lot of listings claiming just serviced that really mean it powers on. A genuine restoration touches the switches, the caps, and the bias. Ask the seller directly what was actually done, and ask for photos of the open chassis if they have them.
Budget $800 to $1,500 for one that's truly gone through, and you're getting one of the best-sounding, best-built receivers of the entire decade. Number 3. Pioneer SX-750. I left the big Pioneer flagships off this list on purpose, and if you've watched my previous video, you already know why. Some of those monster units used output transistors that are essentially extinct now, no matter how beautiful the blue dial looks under your shelf lighting. The SX-750 sidesteps that entire problem. It's a smaller, roughly 35 to 45 watts per channel receiver, using far more conventional, far more available output devices, which is exactly the kind of compromise I want you to make if long-term ownership is the actual goal here, not just the photo on the shelf. On the bench, it's a joy to work on. The board layout is sensible, the test points are accessible without a contortionist act, and the rotary power switch, the same basic design Pioneer used across this whole family, is the one component I tell every owner to watch closely. These switches can arc internally over the decades and develop a crackling or intermittent power-up, and while it's a known, well-documented repair, it does need to be addressed properly rather than ignored, because a failing switch can eventually take other components down with it if it's left to degrade. Beyond that switch, this is about as low drama as vintage solid-state gets. The tone control section uses standard parts, the input jacks are simple to retension if they've gone loose, and I've never had to chase down an exotic part to finish a repair on one of these. The fair part, it doesn't have the visual drama of its bigger siblings, so it won't be the centerpiece of anyone's listening room photo, but it'll run reliably for a fraction of the price, typically $350 to $700 serviced, and that switch issue, once corrected properly, doesn't come back.
Number 2. Yamaha CR-640. Yamaha's natural sound engineering philosophy shows up just as clearly in their smaller receivers as it does in the big CR-2020 I've talked about before, and the CR-640 might be the purest expression of that philosophy on a budget. Around 35 watts per channel, modest by today's expectations, but the circuit is clean, the distortion figures from the factory were genuinely excellent for the era, and the build quality doesn't feel like it was scaled down to match the lower price point. It feels like Yamaha just used good engineering at every tier in their lineup, top to bottom. The components inside are conventional and well-documented, and the same recurring power supply regulator heat issue that shows up in Yamaha's bigger units from this period is present here too, just at a smaller, more manageable scale because there's simply less current flowing through the stage. It's a known fix, and any tech who serviced one Yamaha receiver from this family will recognize it immediately on a different model, even one they've never personally opened before. The volume and balance pots can get noisy with age, which is normal wear, not a design flaw, and they clean up or replace easily without hunting for an obscure part. I'll add this from personal experience. The tuner section on the CR-640 has aged better than most of its competitors. The alignment tends to hold, and I rarely have to touch the IF stage on these when one comes through the shop, where on some other brands from the same years I almost expect to. That's a small thing for a receiver review, but if you actually listen to FM, it matters. The honest part is simply that 35 watts isn't a lot of power if you're running large, inefficient speakers in a big room. Match it to a reasonably efficient bookshelf pair or a modest listening space, and it'll be plenty for most living rooms. A serviced CR-640 typically runs $250 to $550, and it remains one of the most underrated long-term receivers from a brand most people only associate with its flagship. Number 1. Marantz 2238B. And here's the one I'd hand down. The 2238B doesn't get the attention the blue dial 2270 gets, mostly because it's smaller, plainer, and was priced as the accessible Marantz back when it was new. But that's precisely why it earns the top spot on a list about trust rather than prestige. It shares the same fundamental design family and much of the same parts lineage as Marantz's larger receivers, which means it benefits from the single deepest restoration ecosystem in this entire hobby. Complete recap kits, widely available output device equivalents, and specialists in nearly every region of the country who've rebuilt these by the dozen. On the bench, the 2238B is honest, straightforward, and forgiving to work on. The power supply is simpler than the big flagship units, which actually works in its favor. Fewer points of failure, fewer exotic regulation stages, less heat to manage long-term, and fewer surprises waiting for the next owner 20 years from now. The dial cord and lamp assembly is the most common service item, and it's a well-known, well-documented job, not a mystery, with replacement cord and lamps both still readily available from multiple suppliers. What really sets this one apart for me, though, is consistency. I have serviced more of these than almost any other model that's come through my shop, and the failures I see are remarkably predictable from unit to unit. The same handful of capacitors, the same wear points on the same switches. That predictability is worth more than people realize. It means a tech can diagnose one of these quickly and confidently, which keeps repair costs down and keeps the unit out of the parts pile. Once a unit has had a proper recap and a bias check, there is very little left inside that should surprise you for decades to come.
The fair caveat: at around 30 watts per channel by factory spec, it is not a powerhouse, and if your speakers demand serious current, look at one of its slightly larger siblings instead. And because Marantz has such strong brand recognition now, you'll see plenty of listings priced like it's a 2270. Don't pay flagship money for the accessible model just because the logo matches. A genuinely serviced 2238B should run you somewhere between $350 and $700. For that price, you are buying into the deepest, most future-proof parts and service network that exists anywhere in vintage audio. That's the list. 7 receivers, none of them perfect, every single one of them honest about what it is and what it needs. I want to be clear about something before I let you go. Sound is subjective, and the condition of any 50-year-old piece of electronics depends entirely on how it was stored, how it was used, and whether the last person who owned it actually knew what they had. 2 examples of the same exact model can age completely differently. I've opened identical receivers from the same production year and found one bone dry inside and the other one perfectly preserved, just because one sat in a damp basement for 30 years and the other sat in a closet. So here's the one habit I'd leave you with if you're shopping this market. Before you ever plug a vintage receiver in, pull the bottom cover and look at the board with a flashlight. You're looking for bulging or leaking capacitors, scorch marks around the power transistors, and any sign that someone already went in there with a soldering iron and didn't finish the job. That 30 seconds of looking will tell you more than any listing description ever will be, and it costs you nothing but a little patience at the seller's kitchen table. I'll leave you with this. Every one of these units was built by somebody on a line in a factory decades before most of us were thinking about streaming a song from a phone in our pocket. They built things to be opened, understood, and fixed, not replaced. That's worth sitting with for a minute. What's still running on your shelf after all these years, and who do you think will be the one fixing it 20 years from now? I'll see you at the bench.